Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergastas, my name is Mesmer. It's time for a guide on how to get ready for PvE content after reaching level 80. The intention of this video is to first provide you with cheap and powerful gearing options that you can obtain quickly after reaching level 80, as well as builds for all classes that can be transitioned into builds with elite specializations afterwards without changing gear again. In general, both power and condition gear options won't cost more than 20 gold in total, often even less. I'll also provide options for easy repeatable farming methods that'll get you exotic and ascended stat-selectable gear pieces quickly enough if you don't mind spending some time. In this video, I don't only want to tell you what gear to get, but also why you would go for particular gear and how large the impact of going for budget alternatives actually is. The focus lies on damage dealing, with boon support for group content and survivability for open world coming in as secondary factors. Generally, I'll assume that you'll have access to at least the core game and one expansion. If you're looking for post-level 80 content, it is very likely that you have at least one expansion anyway, since they usually come in bundles. For the farming methods, it can be helpful that you have access to some living world episodes because they include very efficient farms for ascended trinkets, for example. You're often actually better off spending gold on these living world episodes instead of crafting or buying expensive gear, but more on that later. In either case, in the second main section, I'll show you the builds that I find to be the most enjoyable and efficient for early post-level 80 PvE content on all 9 professions. I'll also mention additional options so that you have the full picture though. For these builds, I concentrate on the following 3 aspects. A. Ease of use. Since you're just starting, builds shouldn't be too complex to use in both open world and instance content. This includes giving you range, a decent amount of survivability, and options for group utility / boon coverage. B. Transition synergies. Ideally, you'd have several options for elite specializations to unlock and play without having to invest in additional costly gear. And last but not least, support options. In order to facilitate getting into group content, it is nice if you have possibilities for simple support builds that allow you to fill slots aside from simply doing damage. That said, arguments can be made for other build options too. All guides I provide are meant to make you understand builds and gearing so that you can take them up to higher levels for more enjoyable gameplay. Let's begin with gearing up for beginners. For gearing up damage builds, you'll have to understand that Guild Wars 2 offers 2 main playstyles to deal damage: strike damage and condition damage. Back when I started playing the game, I made videos on how these work exactly. I'll put links to them in the description. There are some builds that make use of equal shares of both, like hybrid Soulbeast, but most builds mainly choose one of them so that the weight of that damage type strongly outweighs the other. Before we start, it's also important to know that different gear pieces grant different amounts of stats. So when you cannot afford all pieces of gear, it is best to go for the pieces that grant the most stats first. Weapons give the most stats, one-handed half of that, and affect your weapon strength, followed by the amulet and then the chest piece. Rings and legs give the same amount, followed by accessories. Then we have the helmet, the backpack, and finally shoulders, boots and gloves. So if you have the backpack or smaller armor pieces with other suboptimal prefixes, it's not a big deal. In total, weapons and trinkets excluding the backpack already cover more than half of your stats. As we will see, it's often better to prioritize these items first. In this section you'll see a lot of numbers and figures. For a lot of the comparisons I do from now on, I use the discretized gear optimizer. It uses input from benchmark rotations to assess the effectiveness of different gear choices. So in essence, it tells you what kind of DPS differences you can roughly expect when you do the benchmark rotation with different gear. Connor Concane has a good intro video to the discretized optimizer, check that out if you want more detailed info on it. Now, the starter gear that most players look at after reaching level 80 is exotic gear. This is, in terms of stats, the second to strongest gear level in Guild Wars 2. The next step after exotic is ascended gear, which has the highest stats tied with legendary gear. Legendary then again brings in additional convenience. Before we start, know that you always lose damage from using exotic weapons, armor and trinkets simply because you lose stats. The loss is generally larger for power builds compared to condition builds. This loss partially compounds with the loss from using budget prefixes, runes and sigils that we will see later. Here's a list based on the gear optimizer where I left everything else equal, but simply changed from ascended to exotic gear. As a general rule of thumb, the difference for power builds ranges between 8 to 10%, while Condi builds mostly evolve around 4%. Now you might think, wow, let's go get exotic condition gear then. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. For power builds, weapon strength comes into play here as an important factor, because strike damage for weapon skills also scales with that. So using ascended weapons on power builds is priority number 1, since you then also benefit from the higher weapon strength. For this comparison, I simply assume that all skills scale with weapon strength, so the difference is likely smaller for power builds anyway. Speaking of power builds, let's start with power builds. Power builds mainly deal strike damage. Strike damage can best be described as direct damage, which scales with 3 attributes and weapon strength. Power and weapon strength determine the base damage, precision increases critical chance, and ferocity increases critical damage. That is why going for gear that includes power, precision, and ferocity is ideal for power damage builds. The main stat combination you'll see on power builds, therefore, is Berserker. On some builds, you'll see other attributes. Assassins is used to trade power for critical chance 1-1 to reach 100% crit chance, and Dragon is used on some builds that overcap crit chance with full Berserker to gain critical damage and health for that. Another stat combination here can be used is Marauder, which is similar to Dragon but includes more crit chance instead of crit damage. It's usually not ideal though. I did some research via the wiki and listed the average per piece prices of the respective attributes that are relevant for good all-rounder builds that focus on damage and boon support for group content, plus attributes you can pick for higher survivability. Out of the damage attributes, it's very convenient that Exotic Berserker is also among the cheapest options for all categories. As you can see from the table though, when it comes to exotic trinkets, they all cost more or less 2 gold per piece. So if you want to go for other more expensive attributes, exchanging trinkets, especially rings and amulet, is a good option. The main gear stat for support builds is Diviner. This trades some power, precision and ferocity for a good chunk of boon duration. This is particularly relevant for quickness or alacrity DPS builds that focus on sharing those boons with allies, since you get the best stat density out of Diviner. You can also use it for open world purposes, since it will help you maintain and share essential boons as well. It's the most expensive option though when it comes to armor and weapons, so if you decide to go for this, use trinkets or farm stat-selectable items. More on these later. In order to understand when and how you can replace Berserker gear, let's provide the baseline first. As a general rule of thumb for power builds, you want to prioritize reaching 100% crit chance. This is partially because it's often mathematically superior, but also because there are other factors like traits and sigils that trigger on critically hitting enemies. After that, you want to maximize power, then ferocity. There are exceptions to this based on the relation of power and ferocity that you have before adding more, but it's very minor, so we'll neglect that for now. When we compare the stats that we get from full ascended gear without roots and sigils and the same thing in exotic, we see that we lose 60 precision from going for exotic. Since 21 precision translate into 1%, that is almost 3% crit chance that you lose. Since many benchmark builds are tailored to crit cap exactly, we'll need to cover this difference more or less on all builds that we're looking at. In order to see how one could do that, let's go through the gear pieces starting with armor. For power builds, Berserker armor is easy and cheap to come by. You can simply search for Nika, Devona or Zed depending on the armor weight you need. These armor sets are dirt cheap and form the perfect baseline for power builds. This will cost you 2 to 3 gold maximum for all 6 pieces. For the rune, things are a bit more complex. Scholar runes are the ideal option for most endgame builds for power, but are also very expensive. They cost 24 gold for a full set at the time of making this video, which is more than the entire rest of the gear. Since removing runes and sigils from an exotic piece isn't easily doable in Guild Wars 2, it makes sense to go for a cheaper alternative and go for Scholar once you start acquiring Ascended Berserker armor. The good alternatives for damage runes are unfortunately a bit scarce. A rune that's both cheap and powerful is Eagle. This costs way less and trades the power from Scholar for precision and grants 10% damage versus enemies below 50% health instead of the 5% whenever your health is above 90% from Scholar. For many builds though, Eagle grants too much precision even with exotic gear, so that you have to balance it out somewhere else. In order to do that, you can simply swap in a few dragon pieces to compensate. This will trade some precision for higher vitality and some power to ferocity 1-1. Now how much damage do you lose by going for Eagle versus Scholar? In order to assess the damage difference between an exotic setup that uses Scholar and an exotic setup that uses Eagle, I use the discretized gear optimizer again. Understanding how the comparison works involves a bit of math, so I'll redirect you to the video on power damage I did 2 years ago. Time flies, doesn't it? This chart displays the damage differences between Scholar and Eagle on the power builds that currently have benchmarks available, and as you can see, you lose at most around 6% by going for Eagle. Generally, this amount increases with the native crit chance bonuses an elite specialization uses. Bladesworn and Chronomancer do not have native crit chance bonuses in the DPS build, so Eagle is very good on these. Not that these two ideally use Thief runes, but Thief runes are also more expensive and require you to flank for being superior, which I actually wouldn't bother with if you're just starting. I'd see Eagle as very much worth it here, especially that Scholar loses 5% damage whenever your health drops below 90%, which will happen very often in open world and solo gameplay in particular. With Eagle you don't have to worry about flanking and you also don't have to worry about your own health. The most expensive part of gearing are exotic trinkets, so amulets, rings and accessories. They cost around 2 gold a piece regardless of the power-based prefix you choose. If you cannot afford exotic pieces, you can also go for rare trinkets first, which are cheaper. These only exist for berserkers, assassins and knights though, so the choices on rare trinkets are actually limited. For the backpack you have 2 options from my point of view. The first is to craft an exotic crafter's backpack. These are available for every crafting profession, but you need to have the profession on level 400 to craft the most powerful one. The lower your crafting level, the lower the level of the backpack you can craft. Since you'll need crafting at some point anyway, it's definitely worth to level any line for this. The chef crafting line is very cheap to level to maximum, it only costs a few gold and also allows you to make one of these. Simply start by buying the crafter's backpack frame from the merchant next to the crafting station and go through the tiers one by one. Crafting the highest tier of these requires a few globs of ectoplasm and basic materials, and according to Guild Wars 2 efficiency usually costs around 80 silver to 1 gold in total. These backpacks have the advantage of providing higher stats than usual level 80 exotic back items despite being level 78. They also allow you to put an infusion in for fractals and are stat selectable, including berserkers. It can also be used by all your characters since it's account bound, so you only need one of these to cover all your power builds. This would always be my budget priority number 1. You can use this until you get an ascended backpack without losing anything. The second option is to buy a rare level 65 backpack for 12 silver, the Lucky Lanterns. These are also stat selectable but have lower stat density than the crafted ones and you can't put an infusion in. This is just for the lazy people out there who don't want to level crafting. These also exist in exotic but cost at least 7 gold and do not have a higher density than the crafted ones. I don't think the exotic ones are actually worth it since the crafted one gives you much higher value. If anything, you can use the crafter backpack and then go for ad infinitum via fractals. This gives you infused ascended backpacks which are stat selectable along the way and a legendary one at the end. As with basically all legendary items, Muck has a great guide on this. Regardless of which one you choose, you can upgrade these with a Ruby Jewel on level 65, which has Berserker stats on it. For weapons, we'll be going for either Dragon or Berserker, which are both quite cheap. If you want additional survivability, you can also swap in Knight weapons here, which cost around the same gold as the other 2. They will cost you around 1 to 1.5 gold maximum, and the 2 sigils we'll use are Force and Air. Both sigils are fairly cheap, around 1 to 1.5 gold for both. They provide nice and easy damage for open world and instance content. If you can't afford the Force sigil, you can buy any cheap sigil that includes Slaying, since it will give you the 3% damage at all times and another 7% against a particular type of enemy. Now let's sum the costs up for the power build. I used the Revenant build as an example here, but the costs won't change much for any other power build. If you decide to go for the cheapest setup, having a full setup with Eagle Runes will cost you around 11 gold, while the full exotic setup costs around 19. With these setups, you can do most instance content of the game in open world very well. Going for full damage gear will make you a little squishy when playing solo. For that reason, you can mix in as many pieces of Knight gear instead as Berserker as you like. Instead of changing gear, I'd always recommend changing traits and food items first though. I'll discuss the survivability options later when I talk about the respective classes. Power builds are very straightforward to gear up and particularly good at killing smaller, weaker enemies. They are, however, a bit harder to execute when soloing harder content. That is where condition builds shine. Condition builds are generally more complex to gear up, but will make it work for the same gold cost. Condition builds make most of the damage from 2 attributes, condition damage and expertise. Condition damage, as the name says, increases the damage you do with the 5 damaging conditions in the game: Torment, Burning, Poisoned, Bleeding and Confusion. They all have specialties, but I'll redirect you to the Condy damage video I made for that a while ago. Expertise increases the duration of the conditions you apply. The duration extension caps out at 100%, effectively doubling the duration. Any additional duration from traits or gear will be wasted. A lot of specializations bring along condition duration, so make sure to not overcap. Therefore, in summary, the higher your condition damage and condition duration, the more total damage you deal with every condition that you apply. Since total condition damage only scales with those 2 attributes, this gives you more freedom on the other attributes compared to power builds, which is nice. Once again, I looked through the wiki to determine the average per piece prices, but now for Condy builds. The ideal option for damage is usually Viper. This provides condition damage and expertise paired with power and precision, so this also has a decent amount of power damage built in. Precision also comes in as a factor since many builds involve traits that apply conditions on critical hits. Especially Condition Virtuoso stands out here since you actually prioritize critical chance over Condy damage on it. Sinister pieces are mixed in on builds that overcap duration with full Viper. It gives higher condi damage, power and precision compared to Viper. There's also Grieving, which follows a similar idea but is harder to obtain in general, so I didn't include it here. When looking at the cost table for the different options, you can see that Viper and Sinister are, unfortunately, very expensive. That is why we'll go for cheaper alternatives in the Stepping Stone gear. You can farm Viper or Sinister gear relatively easily later on, and I'll show you how in a dedicated section after this one. It's important to remember that even in condition builds, there is a certain share of power damage that you lose when not going for Viper, Sinister or Grieving. All the following options do that, so you will inevitably lose damage by using them. Carrion is a cheap starter alternative that doesn't have expertise and trades precision for vitality compared to Sinister. Rampager is only used on one build, Condition Virtuoso, since it requires an emphasis on 100% crit chance. For support builds, Viper is often exchanged with Ritualist because that includes concentration for higher boon duration. It trades the power damage attributes for vitality and concentration. When you decide to go for rare armor and exotic trinkets, this is a very good and cheap starter alternative for a set of classes. Ritualist also entails the benefit of having higher boon coverage, which can lead to an increase in damage when external boon supply is low. If you want additional survivability via toughness, you can exchange any Viper or Ritualist piece for Trailblazer and any Sinister, Grieving or Carrion piece with Dire. Trailblazer is unfortunately very expensive, but there are somewhat cheaper weapons on the trading post that cost less, glitched adventure weapons. The alternatives that are most important for us now are Carrion and Ritualist. Whether these are good alternatives mainly depends on two factors: the share of power damage in the condition builds and the share of damage from a single condition. In order to illustrate why, I took the current benchmarks and extracted the share of damage from the respective conditions. As you can see, most condition builds have a single condition that deals more than half of the damage, and it's always either burning, bleeding or torment. For these builds, using Carrion usually is a relatively small damage loss because it can obtain condition duration on your main condition via other means. The second determinant for the effectiveness of Carrion or Ritualist is the share of power damage. Both Carrion and Ritualist trade power-based attributes for vitality and or concentration, so builds with higher power damage lose more from using them. So if you want to use Ritualist or Carrion, it's best to do that on builds that have moderate power damage and high damage from a single condition. There are other minor factors that come into play here, like stat conversion or shroud mechanics, but more on that later in the dedicated sections on particular classes. Let's begin with condition armor. For the armor pieces, we'll go with rare Ritualist gear or exotic Carrion as a starting point. This costs less than 3 gold for all 6 pieces and has the highest condition stat density at low cost. The weights of these two prefixes depend on the respective build because classes include varying condition durations, etc. as I said before. If you want higher survivability, you can replace any Carrion piece with Dire. After buying the cheap gear, you can go for stat-selectable armor, which is a very good option for condition builds. For condi builds, the runes and sigils are a bit more difficult to assess, since they vary strongly per build. As we've seen before, a large share of builds deals the highest share of damage via burning, bleeding and torment. In turn, it is helpful to use runes that boost those conditions. For all builds that involve burning, so Firebrand, Willbender, Holosmith, Weaver, Tempest, Balthazar runes are very good. 50% burning duration, more health and lots of condition damage, and they cost only a few silver per piece. For builds that involve bleeding, like Daredevil or Soulbeast, afflicted runes are a good starting point. They give 30% duration on bleeding, 20% on poison and 10% on the rest, plus a good chunk of condition damage. These runes are within a few percent damage of more expensive alternatives like Crate. Note that it can make sense to prioritize Crate runes on Reaper and Virtuoso, for example, since they get so much out of the additional bleeding duration. For Torment focused builds, there's no real budget rune. Tormenting runes cost close to 6 gold a piece at the time I made this, so they are very expensive. There are remedies for this issue though. On condi builds, there are sigils that boost the duration of a particular condi by 20%, and food that further boosts it by 15%, adding up to 35%. They're often suboptimal because of how strong some other sigils are, and sometimes it's more effective to use prefixes with expertise on. For the budget builds, they can be a very good way to obtain condi duration that would otherwise be very costly. Other cheap alternatives that work well on some builds are Scavenging and Lich. Scavenging has a lot of condi damage and vitality, but only 20% on poison. This works well on Specter, for example. Lich has a 4% condi damage modifier on its final piece and 15% condi duration. It also brings in additional vitality. This is good on builds that mix a bunch of conditions, since it boosts the duration and damage of all of them. A rune that doesn't cost any money but dungeon currency is the Nightmare rune. This grants 175 condi damage and a whopping 25% overall condition duration. This is a very good all-rounder rune for builds that don't overcap with it. To get it, you have to do a couple dungeon paths in explorable mode. You can do any dungeon path for this and buy the rune. Nightmare runes are actually ideal for many builds that use a variety of conditions like Scourge, Mirage, Harbinger or Renegade. You can make lots of other builds work well with this too, since you can always use less expertise on your gear. Finally, using 5 Trapper runes and a black diamond is an alternative you can craft that costs around 2 gold per rune if you buy all the materials for it. This requires ancient bones and globs of ectoplasm. If you have a bunch of those 2 materials already, crafting this rune won't cost much. This combination is very close to Nightmare runes since the first 5 bonuses are exactly the same. You can use a black diamond as the 6th item since the final bonus of Trapper runes is actually useless. For conditioned weapons, I recommend just going for carrion weapons as a starting point and then going for stat selectables via weapon collections. More on that in a bit. If you want a little more survivability and don't mind spending a little bit of gold, get glitched adventure weapons. These have Trailblazer stats on them. The costs for them vary quite drastically though, so it depends on the weapon that you need whether this can actually be worth it. As for sigils, things are a little iffy. The 2 most prominent sigils, Torment and Bursting, are very expensive with around 8 and 6 gold respectively. If you don't want to spend too much on sigils, let's say not more than 2 gold, then you can only use Demons, Agony, Earth, Smoldering, Geomancy and Venom. Getting some overall condi duration via a Malice sigil for builds that could use it is also very expensive. On some builds, not being able to use expensive sigils alone actually leads to a few % DPS difference, especially on builds that don't rely on Earth sigils natively. Which of these sigils you should choose depends on the build, so you'll see that later. For trinkets, the only 2 affordable options are Ritualist and Carrion, which cost 2 gold apiece in Exotic. Carrion can also be bought in Rare for around half the price, so if you can't afford Exotic, you can go for that. If you want more survivability, you can also buy some Dire pieces instead of Carrion. For the backpack, the 2 options are basically the same as on Power. Either craft a crafting profession backpack for around 1 gold, or buy a cheap selectable level 65 rare backpack from the TP. On either of them you can put an embellished brilliant chrysocolla jewel which has carrion stats on it. Now what kind of damage loss can you expect by going for budget gear instead of the ideal setup? I set the best budget setups I could find on the optimizer in comparison to the ideal gear. I separately included Nightmare runes here as an easily farmable option. As expected, especially builds that apply lots of burning and bleeding stand out here. Firebrand, Tempest, Willbender, Daredevil and Weaver. Other builds with a high share of power damage and a mix of conditions lose more damage by going for budget gear. Note that the damage loss for Virtuoso and Reaper decreases drastically if you spend the money to get crate runes and use cheaper gear instead. Summing up the costs for a Guardian example, we can see that condition gear can actually be cheaper than power gear. This is due to the fact that Ritualist armor pieces in Rare are actually very cheap, and runes often only cost a few silver. The full budget setup with a Rare TP backpack and Rare trinkets costs 4.56 gold, while the full exotic setup with a crafted backpack and exotic trinkets costs slightly under 14. These costs will vary depending on what kind of setup you choose, but in general it should be under 20 gold. Before we move on to Ascended gear, I want to talk about another good way to obtain the gear you want in exotic, Stat-selectables. Aside from the gear that comes with static prefixes, there are items that allow you to choose 1 prefix out of a fixed selection, or even out of all prefixes. The downside of these items is that they rarely come from the trading post. There are only few items you can buy directly that do not cost a fortune. The ones that are worth mentioning are the Ice Golem small box, which allows you to select a headpiece of any armor weight and then you can select any prefix you want. This costs around 1 gold and is thus very affordable. I recommend getting this and selecting Viper on Condi builds or getting it for power builds if you want a cheaper Diviner piece. The second item are the Ebon Vanguard shoulders. These work the same way as the Ice Golem box but give you a shoulder piece. Since shoulders have low stat priority and this costs around 4 gold, I don't see this being worth it most of the time. If you are one of the lucky Char out there, you can also buy Char War Mask boxes, which are another selectable headpiece and cost only 10 silver. This is always worth it over any other option since you can simply select Viper on this. The most prominent stat-selectable armor is Bladed armor. For this you need to complete the meta event in Verdant Brink, which is usually also the first zone in Heart of Thorns you will enter after going through Dry Top and the Silver Wastes. Completing the meta event with full participation always gives you a Bladed armor box, which allows you to select any stat-selectable armor piece. Killing the Wyvern Matriarch in the meta event has a chance to drop both a headpiece and gloves, so try not to miss out on it. Once you've unlocked the second mastery in its lore and gathered a good amount of airship parts, you can also buy Bladed armor boxes for 500 airship parts and 1 gold from its mastery vendors. One of these vendors is located directly at the very first way shrine when entering Verdant Brink. Bladed armor is very good if you want to go for more expensive prefixes in exotic like Viper, Diviner, Ritualist, Sinister and the like. For trinkets we'll skip exotics, because it's actually much better to go for easy ascended trinkets in the next section. In terms of weapons, you should absolutely look at the specialization collections. Once you've picked an elite specialization you want to level and have 30 hero points ready to use, you can unlock the elite specialization itself. This will immediately give you a stat-selectable exotic weapon, the weapon that comes with the elite specialization. These will always have one useful stat you can select for either power or condi builds. Some of them are a little wonky for the specialization itself, but most of them are pretty good. I looked through them and picked out the best stat you can choose on these weapons. Once you unlock the specialization, you'll also unlock the respective collection. These collections involve tasks that are spread around the expansion of your elite that you want to choose. These are among the easiest ways to obtain an ascended weapon in the game, and you should absolutely do them to obtain the weapons. And this brings me to Ascended gear. Ascended gear is much harder to obtain than exotic gear and almost always entails a lengthier process. There are some random drops you can get from instance content, but you shouldn't rely on them to gear your character. It will be slower than the ways I'll provide in this section. Whichever way you approach this, it's not worth rushing it, since that will usually only lead to you spending a lot of money that you could have avoided. We've seen before that having the right prefixes, runes and sigils on exotic is just as important and costs way less, so do that first. Now let's continue from before with ascended weapons. Especially for power builds, ascended weapons are important because they increase the weapon strength, giving you a good jump in damage immediately. The easiest weapons you can obtain are the elite specialization weapons. I've talked about these before. These involve various tasks such as completing a map in a particular expansion, killing certain bosses, completing events, etc. All of them are doable for beginners and are not too time consuming. Simply look for the collection tab in your achievement panel and search for the one you want to complete. The End of Dragons weapon collections also have synergetic value, as they enable you to buy ascended trinkets very cheap afterwards from the green profit shard vendor in Arborstone. These only cost 50 profit shards and 2 gold. You have to complete the Harvest Temple Strike mission for this, but it's surely worth it. Another collection worth looking at is the Khaled Ball collection. You can do this one after completing the Heart of Thorn story. Just look for the side stories panel and then choose the Knight of the Thorn collection. Then perform the tasks as listed. This will give you an ascended greatsword, which you can change into a scepter, shield, sword or dagger afterwards. Finally, vendors from raids and End of Dragon strike missions offer ascended weapons for the respective currency. If you have acquired enough currency over time and want to spend it, weapons are a good starting point for that. Aside from these collections, the main weapon to obtain ascended weapons is to craft them. I don't really recommend doing that though, and we'll talk about alternatives in a second when we go through ascended armor. Moving on to ascended trinkets. Trinkets are very important since, remember, they are responsible for a large share of your stats. The most efficient ways to obtain trinkets come from various Living World Season 3 and 4 episodes. They involve farming particular crafting materials from nodes, which you can then trade in for ascended trinkets. The trinkets cost both the materials themselves as well as unstable or volatile magic. You can convert the materials into unstable or volatile magic by consuming the crafting materials, but not vice versa. The nodes you can farm are shown on the minimap of the respective map, which is very helpful. My personal favorite farming zones are Bitterfrost Frontier, Bloodstone Fen and Dragonfall. In order to access these zones, you need to have the respective Living World episode and further do a quick story step beforehand. This does include story spoilers, so beware of that. While they do cost gold or real life currency, having 2 of these zones is definitely worth it, because they can give you a full set of ascended trinkets within 1 or 2 weeks of daily farming, and as many sets as you like after that. Each of these zones has different reasons for why I recommend them. In terms of Bitterfrost Frontier, this involves a very fast farm of winterberries. Just grab a character with good mobility and run through the forest and harvest any winterberry bush you can find. Since this is only limited per character, you can do this on every character you have that can access the zone. This takes 5 to 10 minutes maximum. This is still by far the fastest way, especially if you have multiple characters. Next up, Bloodstone Fen. This is not as popular as it should be in my opinion. It is slower compared to some other zones, but the ascended trinkets you get here can be reset at very low cost. So if you want to try another build, you can reset the stats on the trinkets and select the prefix you need. Very convenient. There is a cap on the blood rubies you can obtain per day per account, so it is time gated. Dragonfall is the map that you should go for if you have a larger time window or want to farm trinkets fast. Effective farming here does require you to join a meta train for the map though, which in turn assumes that you have at least a raptor and a griffin available to keep up. If you don't have those, simply go for the other maps though, it's not a big deal. The meta trains here allow you to obtain a lot of Mistborn modes very quickly, and this can be repeated as long as you want since the meta loops infinitely. Note that unlocking the trinket vendors here requires you to do 10 events for the Olmecan out of the Crystal Bloom and Mist Wardens first. Many other zones from Living World Season 3 and 4 have similar currencies and materials, so you can also do farms in more zones to speed the process up. Notable mentions are Draconis Mons and Sandswept Isles, which are time gated per day per account, but they also allow you to farm the currencies on your own. Viora Marches is another good way to convert Eternal Ice Shards and Karma into any of the currency from the other maps. The more of these zones you have, the more farming you can do. Doing meta events in these zones will also reward you with additional materials, so don't hesitate to do them. Now why did I say having either two of these? Both Bitterfrost Frontier and Bloodstone Fen have daily caps per account or per character and do not allow you to purchase all types of trinkets. Bloodstone Fen does not have accessories, while Bitterfrost does not give an amulet. Dragonfall does not give a backpack, so if you want all, including a backpack, you need at least two of these zones. Other good ways to obtain ascended trinkets are from laurel vendors. You get laurels from login rewards and you can buy rings and amulets with core stats from them, including Berserker. If you have enough of them, buy Berserker stuff. Don't buy the accessories though, since they also cost globs of ectoplasm and are therefore much more expensive. If you want an ascended amulet fast, you can craft a Vial of Salt. This is a PvP based amulet, but you can buy almost all materials from it from the TP for around 20 gold. The only materials you need beforehand are 250 Dragonite Ore, Bloodstone Dust and Imperial Fragments. These come from doing basically anything after level 80, so you accumulate them naturally over time. Now what is missing? Ascended Armor. Armor is similar to weapons since the main way to obtain it, or at least the intended way, is to craft it. However, crafting is time gated and quite expensive, and even more expensive if you want to bypass the time gate. So I actually do not recommend crafting Ascended Armor. Instead, I'd recommend to just hop into easier instance content after finishing the elite specialization of choice and obtaining the exotic gear you need. Do that along the trinket farms listed above and you'll be set with a full ascended set of gear soon enough. You can still craft the daily time gated ascended materials and then sell them on the trading post. This will finance the purchase price of the ascended items you can buy from vendors. All of the instanced PvE modes have a random chance to drop ascended items. While you shouldn't rely on them, as I said before, they are a nice gimmick whenever they happen. This holds especially for armor and weapons, where you can reset the stats easily in the Mystic Forge. If you want to know more on that, simply search for stat changing on the wiki. Let's start with lower tier fractals. These do not require agony resistance yet and are a good way to obtain fractal relics and pristine fractal relics. Both of these can be converted into ascended gear. Normal relics can be used to buy ascended items from vendors, but that requires you to craft expensive crafter marks. Pristine relics are a very fast way to obtain ascended berserker rings though. You can also save them to obtain mist trinkets, which are stat selectable and resettable. I don't think that they're really worth it though, especially compared to the other trinkets option I've listed before. Either way, it's definitely worth it to work your way up the fractal levels since the profitability of them increases massively on higher tiers. You'll also have higher chances to drop the random ascended items on higher tiers too. For 10-man content, strike missions are an easy entry point. Strike missions can be accessed from the Eye of the North or Arborstone and require you to complete particular steps of the respective story, so steps of either Icebrood Saga or End of Dragons. For every strike mission completion, you receive blue or green shards that you can convert into ascended items. You can freely convert blue and green shards back and forth, so just do as many missions as you can per day. Note that there is a cap of 100 green shards per week though. The Icebrood Saga strikes allow you to purchase armor and weapons, while the End of Dragons strikes allow you to purchase weapons and trinkets. The trinkets from End of Dragons are tied to the weapon collection, so you need to do those first. This is a relatively slow process, but it's profitable along the way and will provide you with lots of fun and enough gold to purchase the ascended items steadily. End of Dragon strike missions grant 4 gold once per day when you do them, as well as legendary insights if you do 4 out of the 5 existing missions. If you want to commit a little more, you can also do some raids via trainings. They are considered more difficult compared to normal mode strikes, but also give you faster access to ascended items. Especially Wing 1 and Wing 4 are often done in trainings as an entry point, so do them if you can. There are training discords for both EU and NA servers, and you can find raid runs without kill-proof requirements every now and then on the LFG. Raids give you gold, legendary insights and magnetite shards, which you can then convert into ascended armor, weapons or trinkets. Once you get into raids, make sure to start the Envoy collection, which will reward you with a full set of ascended stat-selectable armor as a precursor for legendary armor. A quick reminder before we go on. Make sure to watch Mug's Get to the Point guides before you go into any strike mission or raid so that you have a basic understanding of what's going to happen. As the last part of gearing, let's talk about consumables. Food and utility items are items you can consume to gain temporary stats, usually lasting between 30 minutes and 1 hour. While it's not the first thing you're going to do, in the long run it's worth leveling the chef crafting line to 500 to be able to craft ascended food. The reason for that is that ascended food lasts twice as long as normal food and gives you quite a few additional bonuses, including combat stats. This can be minus 10% damage taken, life stealing on critical hits and bonus experience, karma, etc. It also puts down a feast whenever you use it, allowing other players to use it too. For this you need to do a little collection after you leveled the line to level 400, the gourmet training. This does cost a little bit of gold if you buy all the materials, but I recommend just working on this slowly and steadily. Anyway, let's look at level 80 items for food and utility, for damage, support and survivability, and compare the prices. And here's where the appeal from ascended food comes in, because even though it entails initial cost for the leveling process, the food itself isn't really much more expensive than regular food, since it lasts twice as long compared to most standard food items. So the price per minute for the ascended food choices isn't very different from the rest, but you get additional bonuses. For damage builds I include a bunch of different options. The standard food for power is to use power and ferocity food, and condition damage and expertise food for condi builds. As I said before, many condi builds can make good use of food that includes 15% condi duration and condition damage too, and these are usually quite cheap. For support DPS builds, it's usually more stat efficient to use either Ritualist or Diviner gear, but you can change food on the fly, which is why looking at options including concentration can be worth it. These exist with both power and expertise. For survivability, I recommend going for minus 10% damage taken food, again with either power or expertise. This is noticeable since most damage you take in PvE is strike damage. Against conditions, it's usually better to include enough condi cleanse instead of using dedicated food for it. For utilities, it varies based on your gear. To quote the wiki, utility items convert stats gained from food as well as those from all kinds of equipment, but do not convert stats gained from temporary traits, skill buffs or boons. That said, which utility you want depends on your gear. With beginner condi gear that includes high vitality but lower precision, you can also use a magnanimous tuning crystal since that benefits from the vitality, for example. In most other cases, you want to convert the damage attributes that you have into more damage. Why is using consumables important and a good way for beginners? First off, it's relatively cheap to use them. And second, the stats that you receive from food and a utility item are often on par, if not even better, than using ascended food in the first place. I know this was a lot of information, so before we dive into the builds, let's summarize the main findings. In order to do that, I used the discretized gear optimizer again to first calculate the share of going from ascended to exotic gear, and then going from ideal exotic gear to budget exotic gear. As you can see, the insights from before still hold in the bigger picture. Condition builds with a high share of single condition, low power damage and a budget rune that fits to their main condition can use budget exotic gear very well. Firebrand, Willbender, Daredevil, Weaver, Tempest, all those. For Reaper and Virtuoso I use crate runes and prioritize that over more expensive gear. We also see that power builds lose more from going to exotic gear, but often less from using budget exotic gear than condi builds. This applies in particular to condi builds that mix a lot of conditions. Remember that the step from ascended to exotic on power builds is likely overstated since weapon strength applies to everything in the calculations I made. Overall, and I think that's important to mention, even the worst budget build loses not more than 16% damage. When you look at how high benchmark numbers are at the moment, you can do almost all content in the game, aside from maybe a few challenge modes and strikes and raids and high tier fractals with budget exotic gear. And for fractals that's usually only because you need infusions for agony resistance. Alright, now that you know how to get geared up for PvE, we can move on to the second major section of the video. Here I want to give you my personal favorite builds for beginners on every profession using the beginner gear I presented before. For each profession I'll provide a core build that can be used to transition it into at least one elite specialization. On the core builds I chose to build in safety nets and additional survivability so that they are less punishing for mistakes. These builds should do well in open world events and when soloing hero points for whenever you can't get a group for those. The core builds, as I said, are solely meant as a stepping stone until you have obtained enough hero points to unlock the relevant traits of an elite specialization. I won't go through the basic mechanics of professions here since you have already encountered them during the leveling process. If you use the level boost, I can't help you. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments though. I'll give you a brief overview over the options per profession that can be seen as viable in the current patch and conclude with a build for my personal favorite elite specialization for beginners. Note that while I'll be choosing either condition or power builds as a baseline, it can make sense to get cheap options for both to be able to swap between them. Especially for general event farming, having a good ranged power build can drastically increase the speed. Condition builds, especially ranged ones, are very good at soloing harder content. Since every character has 2 gear and equipment templates by default, that can be done easily. Once you start getting into instance content, you can also take a look at my easy DPS build video where I provide lots of different easy builds for instance PvE. For many elite specializations I also have detailed guides out, so if you want to have more information how to use them easily and effectively, make sure to check these out too. We'll make this quick, so try to keep up. And let's begin with Warrior.
Warriors are masters of weaponry who rely on speed, strength, toughness, and heavy armor to survive in battle. Adrenaline fuels their offensive power. The longer warriors stay in a fight, the more dangerous they become. Bloody bullocks, AI is beautiful.
At the time of making this video, Warrior has 4 viable ways to play it in PvE. Power Berserker, Power Bladesworn, Power Spellbreaker and Condi Berserker. Since 3 out of 4 are power builds, it's pretty easy to justify going for a power build here. Let's do a quick summary of the core build. We're using Strength, Tactics and Discipline here. All 3 provide large damage boosts as well as healing and synergize well. You apply lots of might to yourself to survive, with a combination of Might Makes Right and Mending Might. This creates large amounts of self-healing through the trait choices. If that isn't enough, your heal skill is your emergency button since it makes you immortal for 4 seconds. Use the Axe Burst skill as much as possible, it gives you stability and heals you through the might it grants. Other than that, use the Axe skills on cooldown. Phalanx Strength provides insane healing when you're not alone. You can also use Martial Cadence for stability every 10 seconds. Make sure to use 4 Great Justice to cover Might and Fury on yourself. For CC damage, you can put 2 maces on the second bar. Now, all 3 Power Warrior elites have unique playstyles. Power Berserker involves an aggressive, fast-paced playstyle that requires you to constantly raise the clock and maintain Berserk mode. This is for you if you like being angry. Power Bladesworn is a very bursty specialization that allows you to deal the highest damage in the game with a single hit. Dragon Slash. If you like more tactical and laid-back gameplay, this is for you. Power Spellbreaker is all about removing boons and dealing breakbar damage and is sturdier than the other 2. Don't underestimate its damage though, it definitely holds up to them. This is probably the easiest entry point into Warrior, which is why I recommend going for this one first. If you do this, make sure to get a dagger for the main hand, then replace Discipline with Spellbreaker. The playstyle doesn't change drastically for Spellbreaker, simply use your damage skills, badness and 4 Great Justice on cooldown and win. Also make use of Full Counter, which allows you to block attacks very frequently. All your CC skills, so Banner of Strength and Dagger 3, will give you stacks of Attacker's Insight, increasing your power, precision and ferocity. For more information on Power Spellbreaker, feel free to check out my detailed guide video on it.
Guardians are devoted fighters who protect their allies and smite their enemies by drawing from the power of their virtues. True Guardians are brilliant tacticians and selfless defenders who know how to empower their allies to achieve victory. Why do I say this like a pretentious douche?
As of now, there are 4 viable damage builds for Guardian. Power Dragon Hunter, Power Willbender, Condition Firebrand and Condition Willbender. Firebrand has the ability to provide quickness around it and Willbender can provide alacrity. For Guardian, the most straightforward option to go is for Condi. Since Guardian involves lots of burning, you still have good burst damage on it and you can use Balthazar runes, Smoldering Sigils and the Fishy Rice Bowl food to reach 100% burning duration in full Carrion gear. Power Guardian builds rely on the resolution boon too much for my liking in the context of beginner builds, which is why I went for Condi here. A quick summary of the core Condi Guardian build. We'll use Radiance, Virtues and Zeal. They all boost condition damage and empower your Virtue of Justice and burning you apply. This build lives off staying in range in dangerous situations via Scepter and using Litany of Wrath to heal you back to full every 25 seconds. You can use Sanctuary for large amounts of CC to defiant enemies. Your Virtue 1 triggers burning every few attacks, your Torch 4 and Purging Flames are priority skills for damage. Whether you decide to go for Willbender or Firebrand here depends on personal preference. Simply replace Zeal with either Firebrand or Willbender. You don't need to do anything else, the Viper X comes with unlocking Firebrand, so you don't need to buy that. Willbender gives Guardians higher mobility through movement-based virtues. This is a very good option for general open world roaming and dealing damage. This is my favorite pick for beginner Guardian gameplay, since you can do very good damage with a very simple playstyle and reach good survivability by changing the armor to dire without much additional cost. The playstyle for Willbender doesn't change fundamentally, but you gain an improved toolkit. You lose the general passive effects from all virtues, but you can activate them to gain a buff that includes the passive effects and other benefits. On Willbender, you can use your virtues to cover a lot of ground quickly. Every few physical attacks, your virtues still apply their effects, but they also gain active ones. Virtue 1 deals damage and dashes you forward, Virtue 2 heals you and gives nice boons, and Virtue 3 teleports you to the target location and grants Aegis and stability every few attacks. Make sure to use Virtue 1 on cooldown, since it makes every third attack apply burning. If you want more info on how to play this, again, check out my Willbender guide. Since Condi Willbender has good mobility, good burst and decent range, you can use it pretty much anywhere.
Heavily armored and equipped with the otherworldly powers of the Mists, Revenants channel Tyrion's legends to slaughter foes, unleash chaos on the battlefield, and support their allies. I'm heavily craving plum pudding right now, not gonna lie.
As of now, Revenant has 3 viable damage builds out: Power Herald, Power Vindicator and Condition Renegade. Power also gives you the ability to provide quickness via Herald and Alacrity via Renegade, which is why we'll go for power builds. Condition Renegade is one of my favorite builds of all time though, and it provides a lot more range. Nonetheless, I think build flexibility wins here, so we'll go for power. Let's briefly summarize the core beginner build again. We're using Devastation, Invocation and Retribution. All boost damage and survivability and synergize well. You siphon a lot of health via Battle Scars. You gain stacks of Battle Scars via your heal skills or applying vulnerability. Sword auto attacks and Sword 4 apply vulnerability, so you heal quite a bit from these. Use your sword skills for damage. Sword 3 is an evade as well, so you can use it to dodge attacks. Maintain Vengeful Hammers and Chalice and Impossible Arts and Shiro for damage. Alternate between Shiro and Chalice. Chalice gives you more survivability via Vengeful Hammers too. Your Rev 2 skill, Ancient Echo, gives you 50% damage reduction for 3 seconds and additional energy. Use Forced Engagement in Chalice for CC, and put a staff on the back bar and use staff 5 whenever you need it. This build can be transitioned into either Power Herald, Power Vindicator or Power Alacrity Renegade. For Vindicator you need a great sword, for Herald and Renegade you can keep using dual swords. For Renegade you need some Diviner gear for boon duration though. Simply replace Retribution with Herald, Renegade or Vindicator. Vindicator is a very unique specialization that centers around dodging and does high burst damage and good sustained damage. Dodges actually become a central part of damage in this. The open world Vindicator is so much fun as well, since you can dodge enemies to death. Herald is a more supportive specialization, but these days it also does very nice damage. It's easy to play, provides tons of boons around it and is very survivable. This is my favorite beginner build on the power side. The beginner Herald I chose here is able to swap between a quickness provider and a full DPS build on the fly. For open world, always use the quickness variant because of how powerful the boon is for yourself and allies around you. Camp Glint, maintain a bunch of facet skills, use sword skills on cooldown. You'll provide Fury, Might, Swiftness, Regeneration, Protection and Quickness. Boon Herald is nuts. As if that wasn't enough, your heal skill in Glint will also heal you for the incoming strike damage. Once again, if you want more information on how to play Herald, feel free to check out my detailed guide.
Masters of Mechanical Mayhem, engineers love to tinker with explosives, elixirs, and all manner of hazardous gadgets. They support their allies with alchemic weaponry, deploy ingenious inventions, or lay waste to foes with a wide array of mines, bombs, and grenades. I do this much better than this Mazel guy. He should pay me.
Engineer has lots of viable ways to play it. All 3 elite specializations can be played with power setups, and Mechanist and Holosmith can also be played with Condi. Scrapper can provide quickness for allies, and Mechanist can supply alacrity. Condition setups involve using kits a lot more and are thus more difficult to execute well. There's an exception in the form of J-Drive Mechanist, which is a strong option too. I did a video on that recently, so check that out. Going for power gives you a lot of flexibility, since changing between the 3 specializations only requires you to use different weapons. The beginner build I chose uses a rifle for high range and easy sniping. It's a very good weapon for general open world roaming and tagging. This build uses explosions, firearms and tools. All provide damage, and using more defensive ones usually isn't needed. Explosions and firearms are basically mandatory, tools will be replaced once you unlock the elite. In general, use the rifle skills and tool belt skills on cooldown. Rifle 3 and 4 can be used for CC, the tool belt skill of throw mine is melee though. The healing turret and the med pack drop are good to heal allies. The simple core engineer build transitions into Power Holosmith, Power Scrapper or Power Mechanist. Power Mechanist is a high range build that's very simple to play. It has received some justified nerfs over time so that it now has lower damage compared to other options. It's still very effective for open world roaming though, and a solid pick for easier instanced PvE content. Power Holosmith is an absolute powerhouse for damage. High burst, strong sustained damage and a very fun way to play with the Photon Forge and heat mechanic. It's quite squishy in open world though and harder to survive on. I have a guide video on Holosmith up if you're interested. Finally, Power Scrapper is the beginner elite of choice for me. It's again a sturdier profession with strong damage. Actually, sturdier is an understatement. It constantly generates barrier based on damage dealt, giving you a constant inflow of a secondary health bar. Especially in group content, you're essentially unkillable unless you die to mechanics that instantly defeat you. Scrapper also allows you to provide super speed and quickness to allies around you easily, making a Scrapper a very welcome addition to any group. Permanent super speed and quickness is ridiculous. Don't sleep on Scrapper, it's awesome. To change to Scrapper, simply replace tools with Scrapper and get a Berserker hammer for it. You can still play it with a rifle, which is nice if you want to keep the range. On Scrapper, you gain access to well abilities called gyros. These are AoE effects that provide super speed around you. In order to provide quickness, you need to use leap and blast finishers inside combo fields. Luckily, you have access to a whole bunch of finishers and fields on Scrapper, so you usually don't have to think about that too much. Hammer 3, your function gyro, throw mine and the blast gyro all count as those finishers. Use those skills paired with hammer autos and hammer 2 on cooldown to provide super speed and quickness. In case you want to deal breakbar damage, use spare capacitor to put down a lightning combo field and then hammer 3. And again, if you want more info on how to use Scrapper, I have a more detailed video on it.
Rangers rely on a keen eye, a steady hand, and the power of nature itself. Unparalleled survivalists with traps, nature spirits, and a stable of loyal pets at their command, Rangers can adapt to any situation. I like trains.
As of now, Ranger has 5 viable playstyles: Power Untamed, Power Soulbeast, Hybrid Soulbeast, Conti Druid, and Condition Soulbeast. Druid can also supply Alacrity, while Untamed can supply Quickness. For Ranger, we're gonna go for Power. Power is just as flexible at range, survivability and damage as Conti, and it is much faster in general open world roaming due to its bursty nature. This applies to both Power Soulbeast and Untamed. If you want to mix between the two, Hybrid Soulbeast is also very nice. Quick summary of the core build. Using Marksmanship, Skirmishing and Beast Mastery, all of them provide nice damage. Stay on dual axis and attack enemies from range. Let your pet take the damage for you. Whenever you see that one of your pets is getting low on health, you can swap the pet. Axe skill number 5 is great for damage but locks you in place. Try to use it only when you are not in dangerous positions. The red mower has a heal skill and is used for damage, while the brown bear is very tanky for harder content. The heal skill we heal as one copies boons from you to your pet and vice versa. This is a very strong skill since this applies to all boons. Whenever you need a stun break or an emergency button, use Protect Me. This build then transitions into either Power Untamed or Power Soulbeast. Power Untamed is a solid pick if you like the Bunny Thumper from Guild Wars 1 or simply want to use a hammer. It does good damage and provides a lot of CC through its capability to either unleash the pet or unleash yourself. I also have a guide up for this. Power Soulbeast is a very bursty specialization. Soulbeast allows you to merge with your pet, giving you all the benefits that your pet would otherwise receive, and also enables you to activate the pet skills on your own character. This makes a lot of traits and skills way more powerful, since stat boosts and damage amplifiers then apply to your damage, not the pet. Power Soulbeast synergizes very well with using dual axis. I recommend going for Soulbeast first, since it has range and allows you to get used to a bursty power specialization that's simple to play well. Soulbeast also gains access to stances, which you can then also share with nearby allies. This way you can provide lots of boons to yourself and allies around you. On Soulbeast, it's important to maintain the twice as vicious buff. For that, you need to apply CC. You can do that by simply using X4 on cooldown. Many pets also bring in additional CC skills that you can use when merged. As usual, you can check out my Power Soulbeast guide for more information.
Experts at stealth and surprise, thieves move through the shadows, vanish into thin air, or steal items from their opponents and use them as weapons. Thieves practice an agile, acrobatic fighting style, which makes them very hard to hit. I steal candy from babies.
Thief currently has 4 viable DPS playstyles: Power and Conti Daredevil, Condition Specter and Power Deadeye. Condition Specter has the ability to provide alacrity to allies, and Deadeye has the ability to supply quickness. As the baseline, I suggest going for Conti builds here, and get a cheap power gear setup to be able to use Power Daredevil or Deadeye on demand. For the Conti build, we'll make use of Afflicted runes. For Daredevil, there's no significant difference to crate runes, for Specter it is a small damage loss. Let's summarize the core build first. We're using Deadly Arts, Trickery and Acrobatics. Acrobatics is just a filler here, replace this once you unlock the Elite. Dagger 3 is by far the strongest damage skill that costs initiative, spam it. It's also an evade, which is very nice. All skills that apply Immobilize on this build also apply Poison. Dodging leaves behind caltrops that apply Cripple and Bleeding. For harder content in general open world roaming, swap to Pistol and Dagger. Use Steel to port into melee range and then use Pistol 3 to port out again. You then unlock Repeater, which is a good damage skill. Your Pistol 2 skill also applies Immobilize and Poison. Using the Signet of Malice heals you for each hit you apply to enemies. Especially against multiple enemies, this becomes a powerful healing tool. Overall, use Venoms and Haste on cooldown. Haste provides quickness, fury and might and is a stun break. All of them are instant casts, so you can cast them while doing other things. Use Dagger Storm as an emergency button. It's a long evade that heals you for each attack and applies bleeding on them. When it comes to elites, I don't really have a favorite here. Both Daredevil and Specter are great options. The great thing is that with the gear setup I propose, you can swap between them easily by changing food and a sigil on the scepter or dagger respectively. Daredevil is an evasive specialization that gives you access to frequent dodges and applies mostly poison and bleeding. Through the venoms that are shared with allies, it is greatly empowered when allies are around. Especially when you are not alone, it is a relatively bursty condition specialization. It can be punishing when you get hit, but it's a very solid pick for beginners even in full DPS gear. Through stolen skills, it can also provide great group support, especially in instanced content. Conti Daredevil feels very much like the core Thief build in that you use the dual attacks. With Daredevil, your dodges become another important source of damage though, and you gain a lot more evades. This allows you to survive a lot of things that other builds usually do not. Specter is a more resilient and supporty specialization. The great thing about Specter is that it strongly benefits from increased vitality as its Shadow Shroud scales with your health pool. That makes it a very good contender with Carrion or Ritualist gear. Specter also provides passive healing and alacrity around it when needed, making it a very good pick for group content too. Specter has the advantage that its Shadow Shroud and barriers benefit from the higher vitality from Ritualist and Carrion. It further heals around it for a share of Shroud every time you exit it, which again benefits from higher vitality. You don't lose much damage from this, and this can actually contribute a lot to survivability even in groups. For Specter, you alternate between Shroud and Scepter and Dagger. On Scepter and Dagger, you spam Scepter 3. This is a dual attack that applies lots of Torment. In Shroud, use Shroud 2 and 4 for damage. You apply lots of soft CC conditions on Specter passively, gradually draining Defiance bars. If you need additional CC, you can also use Shroud 5. I have videos on both Specter and Daredevil up. The Specter video is a bit older, but the general information should still be up to date, only the gear has changed. I'll update it as quickly as possible once substantial changes come in. If you want a fast, power-based build, Power Daredevil is a very solid option. It has good mobility, a simple damage rotation, can be used at range with dual pistols and is lots of fun too.
Elementalists are multifaceted spellcasters who channel elemental forces, making fire, air, earth, and water do their bidding. What they lack in physical toughness, they make up for in versatility and the ability to inflict massive damage. Elementalists also love downstate gameplay.
Elementalists are the first profession that uses light armor. They are rather squishy, but there are lots of ways to make them very survivable and powerful in both open world and instance content. Currently, Elementalist has many ways to play it. Power or Condition Tempest, Power or Condition Weaver, Hybrid Weaver or Power Catalyst. Tempest can also provide alacrity to allies, while Catalyst can provide quickness. For Elementalist, I suggest going for condition builds first. The reason is that Power Weaver is very squishy and melee, while Power Catalyst is one of the most complex builds in the game. Condition Tempest and Weaver on the other hand are both easy to execute well enough, and since they mostly focus on burning, also entail pretty good burst damage even for condition builds. They both use Scepter and Focus, allowing you to flexibly swap between them. Tempest is a more relaxed playstyle with lower damage in groups and allows you to camp fire attunement, while Weaver is more fast-paced. Tempest also has better boon coverage on its own and group support, which can be nice in open world and group content too. Let's quickly summarize the core build. We're using Fire, Earth and Arcane for damage. Your Signets keep their passive effects while on cooldown due to the Earth trait written in stone. Your Elementals that you can summon are damage sponges, especially if you summon them in Earth. Stay at range with Scepter and Focus and let the Elementals take damage for you if needed. Use all damage skills aside from Earth 5 on cooldown. For general roaming you can camp Fire attunement. You can also swap between Earth and Fire, but always prioritize Fire attunement. Earth 2 allows you to skip its second cast to gain 250 toughness for 30 seconds. This can be very nice in open world to survive. When you need CC, you can swap to Air and use Air 5. For general roaming, you can also replace the Elementals with Glyph of Elemental Power. Once you unlock Weaver or Tempest, simply replace either Arcane or Earth with them. Keeping Earth gives you better survivability, while Arcane gives higher damage. Tempest is actually my favorite beginner build here, since it does not require you to swap attunements and allows you to easily maintain protection and might on yourself and allies around you. It does require you to be in melee for periods of time, but with protection up, you can outlast most incoming attacks anyway. Protection is actually stronger on Tempest, giving a close to 40% incoming damage reduction. That's massive. On the Tempest build, simply use your Shouts, Fire Signet, all fire skills and Fire Overload on cooldown. With Earth and Open World, you'll keep the passive healing from the Signet while it is on cooldown. For harder content, you can use Elementals as punchbacks just like before. You'll keep protection and lots of might up for yourself and allies around you, increasing survivability and damage for yourself and them. If you need CC, swap to Water and or Air and use skill 5 on both. This build is very straightforward to play, but I plan on making Condition Tempest videos soon enough. If you want a good power option on demand, you can go for Power Weaver. The general concept of it is relatively simple, since you rotate through all combinations of fire and air and use most damage skills on cooldown. For open world, I don't recommend this for starters though, since it is really squishy. Mr. Mystic has a good rotation video for this on his channel if you want to try it out in group content.
Mesmers are magical duelists who wield deception as a weapon, using powerful illusions, clones, and phantasmal magic to ensure that their enemies can't believe their own eyes. Mesmers tip the balance of every fight in their favor. And Mesmers are pink, what are you waiting for?
Second to last we have Mesmer. Nostalgia from Guild Wars 1 brought me to make my first character a Mesmer, and boy was I clueless back then. Nowadays, Mesmer has several viable playstyles. Condition and Power Virtuoso, Condition Mirage and Power Chronomancer. Mirage is able to supply Alacrity, while Chronomancer can supply either Alacrity or Quickness. I did have a bit of trouble finding a satisfying solution for Mesmer because the Condi builds Mirage and Virtuoso use completely different gear, and Chronomancer is generally quite complex and hard to play in open world. I chose Power Virtuoso here as the primary option because it is an easy entry point, the best middle ground between all builds, and Virtuoso allows you to swap between Power and Condi on a single specialization. Both Power and Condi are very easy to play well, have great range, good burst and good enough sustain through Jagged Mind and Aether Signet. The core build plays quite similarly to Power Virtuoso, since we use a Greatsword as a ranged weapon. Greatsword is also a very good weapon for the secondary bar on Power Virtuoso, so it has nice synergy with the Power Virtuoso build too. Let's do a quick summary of the core build. We're using Dueling, Illusions and Domination for damage. Stay at range and attack enemies with Greatsword skills and your Phantasms. Mesmers use Illusions, which are either clones, which attack until killed or shattered, or Phantasms, attacking and then turning into clones. Mirror Images is a stun break, so you can keep it for emergencies. It will also create 2 clones. Combo this with Shatter 4 for at least 3 seconds of immunity to damage after the stun break. Greatsword 4, Phantasmal Defender and Phantasmal Disenchanter are Phantasm skills, which attack targets and then transform into clones. For CC, use Greatsword 5 and Shatter 3. This build is generally tailored to provide lots of clones for you, so you can use Shatters often enough. Once you have 3 clones up, use Shatter 1 and repeat. This constant inflow of Phantasms and clones is important because your heal skill passively heals you for each of them. Once you unlock Virtuoso completely, remove Domination and replace it with Virtuoso. We keep Illusions and Dueling here to generate Self-Quickness, Fury and Might. In group content, you'll ditch Illusions for Domination. Power Virtuoso plays very similarly like the core Greatsword Mesmer, but you don't have clones anymore since they are replaced by blades. Critical hits, both from you and your Phantasms, apply bleeding here, and every 5 stacks of bleeding, you stock a blade. You generate blades very quickly this way, so you can use your Shatters very frequently, and you heal passively for each blade from your heal skill. Since you lose the clones as decoy, you also become more squishy on Power Virtuoso. If you feel like you need it, you can exchange a few pieces of Berserker gear with Knights, use -10% damage taken food, or use Inspiration for more self-healing. For more info on these, check out my Power Virtuoso guide. It doesn't use a Greatsword, but you can adjust it for Greatsword very easily. Switching to Condi Virtuoso from there is very simple. You just need to get a set of Rampager and Carrion gear from the trading post. The most expensive part of Condi Virtuoso are crate runes, which cost around 12 gold if you buy them immediately. There are 2 variants of this, where one uses Dueling and one uses Chaos. I have a guide on the Chaos variant up, as it is more beginner friendly and survivable. The guide is a bit old by now, but the general information still holds since there were no major updates to Virtuoso since then. Finally, I do want to mention Staff Mirage. Staff Mirage is relatively easy to pick up and one of the strongest open world builds there is. It has high range, inherent offensive and defensive boon coverage, including alacrity, and great survivability through permanent dodges and protection uptime. Staff Mirage is a rather slow build when killing mobs and requires you to constantly resummon your clones, which is why I recommend using Power or Condition Virtuoso for general roaming. Staff Mirage is a build that excels at soloing harder content through all its dodges. If you want to look into Staff Mirage, I also have a detailed guide on that up.
Practitioners of the dark arts, necromancers summon minions, wield the power of ritual, and heal themselves with blood magic. Necromancers feed on life force, which they can leverage offensively or use to delay their own demise. Anyone got some tea with a drop of life force for me?
Last but not least, Necromancer. At the time of making this video, Necromancer has 4 viable ways to play it for damage: Power Reaper, Condition Harbinger, and Condi Scourge. Harbinger can supply quickness and Scourge can supply alacrity. On Necro, I want to provide you with my 2 favorite options, Condi Scourge and Power Reaper. Going for Condi gives you more flexibility since you can freely swap between Reaper, Harbinger and Scourge with small adjustments. Despite being the only viable power option, Power Reaper is so good in open world that I still want to cover it. The default option for the core build is Condi. Let's quickly summarize it. We're using Curses, Soul Reaping and Blood Magic. Curses and Soul Reaping are responsible for damage, while Blood Magic gives you more survivability. In this build, minions can be your punchbacks, so if you use them, keep them up and let them tank damage for you. Use Scepter and Dagger skills on cooldown aside from Dagger 4. Your utility skill Blood is Power will put conditions on you, so use Blood is Power before Dagger 4 to transfer the self-inflicted conditions over to the enemy. Going in and out of Shroud with Soul Reaping increases your damage, so do that frequently. In Shroud, use Shroud 2 and 5 to apply conditions. For CC, use the Golem active skill in Shroud 3. This build is tailored to maximize Torment and Bleeding duration with Lich runes once you unlock Scourge. You won't cap the duration on them before, which is fine. Survivability here comes from the traits Transfusion and Parasitic Contagion, one of which heals you and the other one converts all healing you receive into Barrier. My favorite beginner pick to transition this into is Condi Scourge. I chose Scourge because Condi Harbinger and Reaper are squishier and or harder to play. Both are solid picks though if you prefer them. Reaper also allows you to swap between Condi and Power with a single specialization, so there's that. Condi Scourge has ruled PvE for a long time. Seriously, when we look at the builds used in raids for example over different patches, Scourge was among the top builds for a lot of them. Nowadays it hasn't been able to keep up with the power creep through buffs to other builds, but it's still one of the highest return on investment specializations for beginners, and its damage is certainly high enough to not fall behind. It has high range, great utility, strong CC, high survivability and is very easy to play well enough. It also doesn't have the longest ramp up for its damage for a Condi build since it relies on a variety of conditions and has a share of burning and torment in that. If you remember back though, having a variety of conditions is not the greatest starting point for budget gear since it usually requires runes that have universal Condi duration on them. Ideally here you'd be using Nightmare runes. Nightmare runes can be used on all 3 Condi specs for great results, giving you flexibility to swap between them to see which one you like best. For these you have to farm a bunch of dungeon paths. As a starting point, use Lich runes. All 3 Necro specs benefit from higher vitality, since the Shroud size scales with it. Higher vitality therefore makes your Shroud endure more incoming damage, resulting in higher damage in many scenarios. For Scourge, it increases the size of the barriers you apply, making you even more survivable. Once you unlock Scourge, replace Blood Magic with it and the Dagger with a Torch. The playstyle on Scourge becomes simpler because you don't have to go into Shroud anymore. Instead, you gain additional skills. Manifest Sandshade does damage and makes your Shroud skills apply their effects around each shade and yourself. Note that enemies can only be hit by one of these effects at a time, so they are not stacking. This is what makes Scourge so cool and tactical to play, because it allows you to place shades where multiple enemies will be to damage all of them. On Scourge, Shroud now becomes Desert Shroud, pulsing conditions and granting Barrier on activation. Shroud 2 cleanses conditions, 3 gains Barrier and 4 applies Fear for a little bit of CC. For starters, you can basically just button mash on this. We will make use of the trait Plague Sending to use Blood is Power and then go into Shroud once the animation of Blood is Power is done. This will, just like before, transfer the conditions over to the enemy. The other more fast-paced and bursty option for open world is Power Reaper. It supplies basically permanent self-quickness, lots of might and fury, making it very self-sustainable. It also comes with great survivability in Shroud and strong damage nowadays, which was a concern for a long time. I don't actually have a guide for Power Reaper personally, but Connor Concane has you covered with a very nice guide video on this. Simply get the starter gear at Repoche and watch his guide to learn the basics. In open world, I like playing Reaper with Greatsword and Staff. Staff actually makes playing it much easier when facing harder enemies, since you can kite and stay at range for the times outside of Shroud. Staff also brings an additional life force, which is always great to have. Alright, we have all 9 professions covered now. You should now have a good understanding of how to gear up in Guild Wars 2 and a good starting point for any class in PvE content. Remember that the builds I provide are only a framework that you can freely adjust based on your liking. Especially when it comes to survivability, it can make sense to increase it when you're just starting with more difficult post-level 80 content. In the conclusion, I wanted to provide you with useful links that you can use to further refine your knowledge on the elite specialization of choice. Always keep in mind that making quality guides and builds, especially in video format, is a lot of work. So even if something is outdated, it often still has value to understand the basics and general playstyle of classes and elite specializations. Once you do that, you should be able to adjust builds yourself based on changes that happen in the meantime. For people who have unlocked an elite specialization, there are several YouTube channels that aim at simplified builds and general introductions to classes in PvE, with the focus on interaction between traits and skills, rotation basics, etc. Aside from my own channel, I can recommend Connor Concane and Mr. Mystic. For open world builds and as an additional source for builds in any PvE game mode, Meta Battle is a great choice. They often include ways to increase survivability too. If you're looking to master a particular build in raids, strikes and fractals, I can only recommend Snowcrows for rage and strikes and Discretize for fractals. These provide guides in a more traditional written format. There's very nice people there, especially the Discords are helpful if you have questions on particular builds. Snowcrows and Discretize are also the providers of benchmarks and the gear optimizer that I used for the charts and stuff in this video, so another thanks for that. For guides on particular instances and encounters, Muckluck has the best ones. Entertaining, not too long, focuses on what you really need to know to get ready for trainings quickly. Back when I learned about encounters, these helped me a lot. He also has the best guides for legendary items out there. Alright, feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. I hope this video was insightful for you. See you next time and happy gear farming.